Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm Adam Stivers from the Finance Department. I am the co-director of the Menard Family Initiative. So I'll, in a minute, turn it over to the other co-director of the MFI, Dr. Nabamita Dutta from the Economics Department. But here you see our team. So what we do with the MFI, we bring in some guest speakers like we have here today. We do a lot of research ourselves. We do a lot of student research. We have some student fellows who do research with us. Also want to thank the Menard family for their continued support. So this is a part of the CBA, but we're grant funded, funded by grants from the Menard family. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Dutta to introduce our guest speaker.
With that, I would like to introduce our speaker today. We are very excited to have Professor Claudia Williamson Kramer. She's the Probesco Chair of Free Enterprise and Professor of Economics at University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. Claudia's main research interests lie at the intersection of applied economic development and political economy. Claudia has authored over 50 journal articles, co-edited 2 books, and written multiple book chapters, book reviews, and policy briefs. Her research has appeared in popular press outlets like the BBC and The Economist. Claudia currently serves as an editor for Public Choice. That's a very highly ranked journal in econ, and also another highly ranked journal, the Journal of Institutional Economics. She's also on the board of trustees for the Southern Economic Association and on the board of fellows for the Institute of American Civics at the University of Tennessee. She served as the 2022-23 president of the Association of Private Enterprise Education, and has served on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Mississippi Advisory Committee. Claudia originally is a native of West Virginia, earning her undergrad degree in economics from Marshall University and her PhD in economics from West Virginia University. Thank you, Claudia, for coming.
Thank you so much. So I really appreciate the invitation from Dr. Dutta and Dr. Stivers and the Menard family hosting these types of events to be able to come and talk to you guys about some of these ideas, big ideas. A lot of my research has centered on understanding the benefits of different types of economic systems, i.e. capitalism. Then that's spilled over into understanding how culture fits into this picture. And then I've applied that to specifically looking at different gender outcomes. So in some ways, this presentation is summarizing a body of work really since early on in my grad school days until now. And so I'm going to try to make it make sense. I'm going to try to piece all this together for you in the way at least I see it. But I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk to you. And I hope that if you have questions along the way, you will talk to me. So instead of just sitting there and being passive, let's talk to each other. So, right, class is much more enjoyable if it is discussion-based for both of us. It goes both ways. And so we can make this fun and entertaining, and you can ask questions for clarification or pushback, right? So in some ways, I made the presentation to be provocative for that reason. So hopefully you'll react, right? So that's a lot of what we're supposed to be doing as educators, is to make you think. So this is a map of countries based on GDP per capita. And so it's not that economists are obsessed with GDP per capita. It's just a really good, quick measure of understanding which nations are wealthy and which nations are not. And so since basically, I would imagine the beginning of time, but at least in modern economics, when we think about economics coming as its own field, so from Adam Smith, late 1700s, writing at the time of the Industrial Revolution, he's writing and trying to understand what causes some countries to be able to grow, what causes wealth, and some countries are not achieving this. So again, he's writing at the time of the Industrial Revolution, and this is populating in his brain as what's happening. And that's a big, in some sense, still what we're doing. So we're still trying to understand these root causes of development, these root causes of explaining wealth differences. And it is about understanding the wealth creation process. It is not what causes poverty. Poverty is a state of nature. Everybody was basically poor forever, right? So if you look at from the beginning of time, we're poor, there's nothing, all up subsistence level. And then Deirdre McCloskey calls it a hockey stick. All of a sudden we get this giant takeoff. So if you just look at global income, we get the takeoff. Why did that ever happen? That's around the timing of the Industrial Revolution. But understanding then looking globally across countries, it is not that everybody participated in that takeoff. And so the United States, Canada, Australia, Western Europe, as you can see, are the darker blue countries, and those are the wealthier countries. Other countries, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, are at the other end of this extreme. So why does this still happen? So it's, in some sense, trying to understand this big puzzle is ultimately what economists and other social sciences are still trying to do. And so this is what I call, in some sense, the economic puzzle. One of the reasons why I loved economics is it's about problem solving. So even if you don't become an econ major, take more econ, because your entire life is going to be about solving problems. And any type of problem you might have, who you want to marry, how many kids you're going to have, where you're going to work, where you're going to buy, you're going to rent, everything is about solving these problems. And so economics is about a way of thinking, and it helps you be a better problem solver. So what I call the economic puzzle, though, is what is the most effective way to maximize human flourishing while minimizing suffering? That's kind of a big deal. Again, Adam Smith, this is a Smithian problem. And we have some thoughts on it, right? We've in some ways we're restating Adam Smith, and we've also kind of pushed the boundaries a little bit. But the economic way of thinking, the economic approach, why economists are different than the other social sciences who are also trying to honestly understand this puzzle and address this question, is our approach. Our approach is different in econ. We take scarcity as a given, right? So given scarcity, that means we have trade-offs. So I'm sure if you've taken econ, you've heard the phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch. That means every decision, every thing that you do has a trade-off, or it has an opportunity cost. So how do we maximize human flourishing given scarcity? Trade-offs are real. We're self-interested. I have this note, not selfish self-interest. Economists talk about self-interest in a somewhat different way than maybe you think of when you would initially hear the phrase. So what do we mean by that? Self-interest just means that you are trying to do the best that you can to achieve your goals, whatever they might be. So we call our discipline as value-free, meaning you get to decide. You get to decide your preferences, your values, what you like, what you dislike. That's off the table for econ. All that gets left at the door. So given that, given whatever that is, you're also using cost-benefit analysis to try to achieve those goals. So that's what we mean by self-interested. So it's not the selfish self-interested, but basically you're trying to take care of yourself. And then lastly, as individuals, we have competing goals. So we were talking about this earlier with some of the students, and that, at times you want two things that you cannot simultaneously have, right? So we're kind of interesting people. So given scarcity trade-offs, that we are self-interested, and internally we will have competing goals and preferences and values, that's the economic framework that economists try to use to solve the economic puzzle. And so the other way of kind of phrasing this or thinking about it is, how do we turn situations of chaos into cooperation? So the way that we use a lot of jargon. So again, please interrupt if I ever am doing that. I literally have no idea what you're saying. That's quite possible because we use kind of shorthand phrases that if you're in econ, you know what it means, but if you're not, then it can be confusing. So we'll say things like social cooperation under the division of labor. What does that mean? Well, that's how economists talk about this. So ultimately what we're trying to do is turn chaos into situations of cooperation. So why aren't we just all running around stabbing each other in the eye? Right? If you think about, we live quite peacefully. It's not that there's not violence. It's not that there's not bad things that happen in the world all the time. It's just that when you stop to think about, we live quite peacefully, and we've somewhat, in some sense, figured out how to cooperate with each other. That is the big economic puzzle. But we also want to go beyond that, that we're not that we've moved beyond running around and viewing every situation as zero sum, meaning if you have something, I don't, and therefore I'm going to go take it. So we've moved out of that to understand that we actually can have mutually beneficial exchanges. So that's what we mean when we say things like social cooperation under a division of labor. We're talking about trade, mutually beneficial exchanges. Well, when does that happen? So when do we go from chaos or violence into social cooperation? Well, it's about the rules of the game, or what in econ we call institutions. So what are the institutions where bad men can do least harm? So in other words, you're constrained. So what are those rules? That's the big economic puzzle. That's where Adam Smith starts talking about capitalism. That's where Adam Smith starts talking about private property rights. So that's where we're headed. That's the capitalism piece of this, is because we're trying to understand how to maximize human flourishing, and it's all about the rules of the game, the economic system. And that's where we get into the idea of capitalism versus socialism. Whoop, that skipped way far ahead. All right, we'll stop here. So socialism, we got to talk about what do we mean by socialism? Not Bernie Sanders socialism. Bernie Sanders is a billionaire. Bernie Sanders is interesting. Socialism, to an economist, is about government owns the means of production. So if you were in this discussion group earlier, we kind of fleshed this out a little bit. That's another weird jargony phrase. You don't really walk around saying things like the means of production. Means of production, land, labor, capital. Capital means like machinery, equipment, things like that. Technology, that would all fall under that. So public ownership or government ownership owns those things. And yes, that means you, because we, people, are labor. So that when we say public or government ownership of the means of production, that's a socialistic system. And that has certain consequences. Those rules are going to set up incentives for behavior. So again, that's how to think about understanding how this relates to the big ultimate understanding of human flourishing. So it is a centrally planned economy where government then decides how to use our means of production. So how to use the land, how to use the labor, how to use capital. And from that, it's all about kind of in that way, it's centralized planning, it's by decree, and production and distribution are handled both by government, broadly defined. So it can be different types of political systems, but whoever's in that sense, who's ever in charge. So there's some sort of central agency. We tend to refer to that as government, but in terms of making these decisions. So another way of thinking about it is that it's coming top down. Some examples throughout history and currently, so the Soviet Union would be the kind of key example that economists have focused on, both when the Soviet Union existed and then ex post. And currently, you can think about North Korea. So North Korea versus South Korea becomes a very interesting natural experiment. We can talk about that more if you're interested. And then also Cuba. So Cuba's system is still more socialistic than not. But trying to categorize countries along these dimensions, in some ways we're doing it in the extremes, it can be difficult. All right, so then we'll move to capitalism. So capitalism then is the opposite. It's the private ownership of the means of production. So you can own land. So under a socialist system, you couldn't just go buy land, right? The government owns it. So private ownership, private property rights, private property rights over your labor. So you get to decide if you want to work, where you would want to work or not, so things like that. And then from there is where we then start talking about a market-based system. So markets is all individualized or decentralized decision-making. And that's what determines what gets produced and how it gets produced, so the production side. And then those interactions are also going to determine who gets what. So it's both decentralized decision-making or through market transactions, the production and distribution side. Firms compete with each other. Firms competing with each other for customers. So that's ultimately what we mean when we say things like capitalism. Markets then are promoting competition and facilitating voluntary exchange. So that is, I usually have that word highlighted, bolded, voluntary. It is voluntary. That is the way in economics we define capitalism. It is all about voluntary exchange. Some examples. So this is taken from what's called the Economic Freedom Index. And I have this in several slides. You're going to see lots of beautiful art in this presentation, lots of beautiful scatter plots. And so the way that we try to measure systems is on what we call the Economic Freedom Index. So at one end, you're going to have, at the bottom of that index would be the socialistic countries, and at the other end are going to be the countries that are more economically free or more capitalistic. And based on that, the most current rankings, Hong Kong, Singapore, Switzerland, the US, Denmark, Ireland, for example, are your most economically free countries or your most capitalistic countries. Again, I'm happy to talk more about data at any point. All right, so since the 1970s, since the Fraser Institute is who puts this index together, and since they have been doing this project since the 90s, their data starts in 1970, so that's why my graph starts in 1970. But looking just at a global average, so doing what we call a time series of the Economic Freedom Index, capitalism has been increasing since the 1980s. So we have this dip in the 70s, and then since about 1980, global capitalism has been increasing. That maybe isn't shocking to you, because oftentimes if you've heard it, it's usually as a complaint, right? Oh, it's because we've got this problem. We've got this environmental problem. Well, that's because of capitalism. Oh, we've got this. That's because of capitalism. So I find this just really, I find the graph, well, if we love data, we love graphs. I find the graph really interesting. And this sharp increase shouldn't be super shocking. So what happened in 1989? Anybody? Fall of the Soviet Union. Thank you. So that's where you get, so in some sense, the massive increase in economic freedom, because we get this major collapse of the Soviet Union and countries starting to open up tremendously. So things that are included in this index include free trade, size of government, sound money, so that means that you don't have massive inflation, looking at regulation of businesses, regulation of labor, for example, and then property rights and rule of law. So those are the kind of 5 big components within measuring economic freedom. We're trying to measure capitalism. Yeah. Yeah, sure, of course.
Just maybe make students think a little bit more. Do you think if someone can interpret this graph as, is it more flattening out globally, like that, as we're saying beyond 2010?
Yes. And the data here on purpose stops in 2019, because what happened in 2020? COVID. Maybe you guys blocked it out, but like that was 5 years ago. But COVID. And so we had major restrictions on our freedom, including economic freedoms. And so it became actually a weird puzzle. What do we do with this when we're trying to measure it? And so partly one thing to do is, okay, don't include it. But now we're getting several years enough removed. And so some interesting things are, we have a dip in economic freedom globally, and it's starting to, because of COVID, and so we'll see where the trend goes. But yes, it's definitely more of a flattening out. Again, not super shocking, in that the part of the reason for the sharp increase was the major experience with the Soviet Union collapsing, and China became very more free. So it wasn't just the former Soviet Union countries. But in general, over this time period, we do see increases in freedom, in economic freedom. Yes. So we go from 0. So the index is technically from 0 to 10. So that's another thing, is that, so what I'm going to show, actually what was next, is going to look at changes in capitalism and changes in various variables. And so looking at basically growth rates. And so the way that the index is technically captured, so nobody is actually a 0, and nobody's actually a 10. So it does get a little bit truncated. It's a good question. Okay, so capitalism, right? Private property rights, private ownership of the means of production. Turns out that countries that not only are economically free, but that have increased, so increasing in economic freedom, turns out that you experience more economic growth. So these are this data from 1980 to 2018. And it looks at percentage change in that economic freedom index, or percentage change in capitalism and income per capita over the same time period. And so this is country level analysis. You can kind of see the countries are several outliers in terms of just a scatter plot. But as you become more capitalistic, you also experience higher rates of economic growth. You also experience living longer. And so again, sometimes economists are kind of put down for, all you guys care about is income. Well, we care about income because, again, it's a good proxy. It's a pretty good, quick proxy for other things that we care about, like living longer. And so if you break this down into different quartiles, the countries that are the least economically free versus the countries that are the most economically free, like the United States, for example, we live about 25 years longer on average than somebody living in the least economically free countries. That's a major difference. Yes.
Does it graph this like tell us like capitalism causes like an increase in life expectancy? It's just like the relationship between the two.
It's a correlation. It is a scatter plot. Now, what's fun is that over the last 5 to 10 years, our statistical methods have gotten a little bit more sophisticated, and we're starting to be able to do more causal inference than we otherwise would. And the causal inference tests that are coming out supports the correlation. That's a great question. Yeah.
Just going off the assumption that like more socialist countries are more like centralized and more distributed and cheaper healthcare, like wouldn't you expect that countries that are more socialist have like longer life expectancy because like it's easy for like the average citizen to like get access to like a hospital or something?
So teasing out why is a really interesting, as to why more capitalistic countries live longer, is a really interesting puzzle in some sense, given what you're saying. Part of it is to think about why, or okay, so there's access to healthcare versus quality of healthcare, right? So it's what you're getting. And when we try to measure things like how expensive something is, that doesn't take into account access, or like, so if you can see a doctor, maybe it's zero price because nothing's free. So it's zero price, but what if you had to wait a year? That's the trade-off. So prices, by the way, are a rationing mechanism. We're going to get there. So we can ration our healthcare. We got to ration it, right? It's everything's scarce. We got to ration healthcare, just like we do everything else. And so one way of doing it is through the price system. One way of doing it is through queues or waiting time. And that's what you see in socialistic systems. So that data is very skewed for that reason alone, but for other reasons as well. But that's, I mean, it's a good point. Yeah, Adam. Dr. Sheff. Yes. No, this is sober.
Could have maybe socialized medicine like Canada, but otherwise be more capitalism.
That's an excellent point. Yes. Good questions. Thanks for talking to me. All right, so what else? Percentage change in capitalism. So more capitalism. Reductions in extreme poverty. So again, something else we might care about is the very, very bottom. So that's another thing that we hear, right? We hear all sorts of stuff. One of the common things is, okay, so on average, people are wealthier in capitalist countries, or the top. It's all about the top. Nope, it's actually in this case, it's all about the bottom. Turns out people at the bottom, the most extreme, the most poor, being lifted out of poverty. Billions of people over this time period, so for about 40 years. And largely that's driven by China and India. And that's, again, the scatter plots here and correlations, but all of the causal inference tests that are coming out of this research area is showing that it is causal. More capitalism, more years of schooling. So probably not super shocked by the correlations at this point, but so in capitalist country, people stay in school longer. There's a couple reasons we can think about why that's the case. You have higher returns to staying in school. There's more opportunities in more economically free countries. And then there's just more like better education on average. And then capitalism and democracy. So there's this kind of theoretical argument, now we've got the data that supports it, that you can't have a sustainable democracy without more economic freedom, or basically you can't have democracy without capitalism. And that was this argument's about 100 years old now, maybe not quite. And now that we've got some of the data to test it, it's a pretty robust association saying that if what you want, if what you ultimately care about is democracy, then you end up also caring about capitalism, because that's the avenue that gets it to you. And again, if you ever want to revisit this, we can talk after in terms of theoretically why that's the case. Okay, so what is it? What is it? What is capitalism? And so again, just reiterating what we mean when we say capitalism. Free markets, free enterprise, capitalism. Those are phrases that we tend to use interchangeably. It is not an ideology. So it's very specific in the way that we define it. Private ownership over the means of production, private property rights. It has consequences, it has major economic consequences, but it is not driven as an ideology. You have theory and evidence. That's the economic way of thinking. And so we're defining socialism versus capitalism, and then we can look, those are the means, right? And then we're going to evaluate those means. It's all about property rights. My students always at the end of every semester, no matter what I'm teaching, joke that so pretty much every answer on your exam is property rights. I'm like, yeah, pretty much. Good, you got it, right? If that's all you get out of my class at the end of the semester, I'm happy. So capitalism, again, is all about rights. Fundamentally, it's about property rights. So why is this so important? It creates the incentives for what a phrase from Adam Smith is to truck, barter, and exchange. So it incentivizes you to behave a certain way that aligns with being creative, problem solving, being entrepreneurial, being innovative, gaining those gains from trade, those exchanges to take place. So that's part one of understanding. And that's a lot of what we end up focusing on are the incentives from a private property rights system versus the incentives from public ownership or from socialism. So one way of thinking about this, to bring it to be a little bit more personal, is how your behavior changes from if you are renting an apartment or renting your house versus if you own it. Do you think your behavior changes at all in the way that you treat your property? Yeah. Or even if maybe you haven't owned a house yet, but being at your parents' house, where they're what we call the residual claimant. So if they just, punch holes in their wall every other day, and then they should try to sell it, they're going to suffer the economic loss from that behavior. Versus if you're renting, you might lose your security deposit, but it may not completely offset those costs. So it's very different. That's what we're trying to understand. The system, the rules, the institution sets up incentives. And so under a private property rights system, it sets up the incentives for us to behave in a way in which we're trying to capture all those gains from trade, to be innovative, to be entrepreneurial, to solve the problems, for me to solve your problems. And yes, I'm going to profit from it. The second part is that it aggregates information. It communicates information that otherwise is unavailable to us. The private property rights and a market-based system communicates information that we otherwise wouldn't have. So we're going to dive into that a little bit more. I think it's incredibly important. So I don't want to lose that in the conversation. So this leads us to this idea of what we call rational economic calculation. So again, jargony, but I'm going to explain it. So wealth creation requires rational economic calculation. So when we're looking at the map and we're looking across countries and we're looking globally, where some countries are creating wealth and others haven't, part of it is just the basic of why, or what do we mean by wealth creation? And so from that, it means that resources are going to where people value them, or resources are being used to produce something that we want. So the Soviet Union, in some sense, it made a lot of things. It made a lot of nails, it made a lot of cars, but they were cars and nails that nobody wanted. So it was like producing stuff because they were told to produce stuff. So they actually could do it. They could turn inputs into an output. It just was the output wasn't anything that anybody wanted. So that's not creating wealth. So in order to create real wealth, we have to have rational resource allocation. So resources are channeled to their highest social value. The only way to know That is, again, the only way to know if resources are creating wealth is through calculation, through economic calculation. What is that? Tabulation of profits and tabulation of losses. What are profits? What are profits telling a firm? When a firm is incurring profits in a purely free market economic system, to remove any interference from government, so they're not getting subsidized. That's the way I think about it, right? So if you're earning profits, that means you're creating wealth. You're creating value. Otherwise, people wouldn't buy your product. So all voluntary exchange. People would not be purchasing your product if that product isn't solving something in their life and making their life easier. So when, for example, the horse and buggy starts industry, the buggies start incurring losses, what does that signal to that firm? Yeah, we don't need that anymore. We've shifted. We've moved on. We're moving past you. So this is Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction. And we've got a different technology, or we want to get around in a different way. And so losses signal to firms, those resources need to be freed up to move into other areas. People in the buggy making industry need to go work somewhere else. That sounds harsh, right? In some ways, because economics is value free. Like, we remove that. It's just what is. So it's a positive analysis, not normative analysis. So losses say, hey, those resources can be freed up to go make the stuff we want now. The other things that we want that create higher value for our lives, and all that's driven through market interactions. That information is not in somebody's head or some panel of experts' head. That all has to happen and be discovered through market interactions. So we need market prices. So tabulation of profit and loss means you have to have a market price. That's how we calculate, right? If you've been in accounting, some of your accounting majors in here, right? So you got to, if you're doing your books, you got to know what's the price. And so how do you calculate profit and loss? You've got to know the price of what you can sell your product for and the price of what your inputs are. So that requires exchange, right? So we're buying and selling from each other. Market prices, that in order to get prices, we need exchange. From there, we need property rights. You cannot buy and sell something if you don't own it, if you have no right over that. So again, in some sense, we're setting up just a very kind of basic understanding of what it means to have private ownership of the means of production or to have property rights. What is that setting up? And if you've taken a principles of econ class, what does this sound like? What's the graph we love to draw? Supply and demand. This is all about supply and demand. So if you've taken econ 101, whatever the number is, then you've skipped all of this, right? So we just kind of start here. We assume private property rights. So when we're drawing that supply and demand graph, we assume private property rights because you can't do any of that without resources having private owners. So a lot of the beauty of the graph is hidden. The things that are in the background that we have assumed and don't really spend much time talking about is very, very, very important. So we're bringing it to the forefront, which can in some ways be controversial. Okay, we're doing some weird stuff with the clicker. All right, prices emerge through mutually beneficial exchanges, i.e. supply and demand. That's what we mean. But bring it back down to your all's language, back to how we normally say it. So we're talking about, okay, if we need to know how are you maximizing value for society? The way that we can calculate that is through profit and loss. We need prices. We need people to be exchanging that supply and demand. So basically, micro's price theory, what we're trying to teach you all is where prices come from. It's not just arbitrary. It's all through supply and demand interactions. So through supply and demand, prices adjust, right? So we love doing those shifts. But the shifting part, it's not like you get there eventually, but the reason why it's shifting is honestly all of the action. And so prices adjust to reflect changes in preferences, changes in cost. So what's driving it though is what we value. So changes in demand, changes in what people want, changes in what people value. So back to the horse and buggy, we moved to cars, right? So think about now currently with AI and automation, like all of that is getting reflected in terms of both the supply side cost and then what individuals on the demand side, what we ultimately value. For example, when we have an increase in price, that forces us to economize on the product's use. So we get annoyed when price goes up if it's something that we want to purchase. But then it forces you to think a little bit more. Do I really need 3 apples today? Can I just buy 2? Because apparently they're more expensive right now. Eggs, right? The whole thing with the eggs getting more expensive. In some sense, it doesn't matter why they're getting more expensive. From a policy perspective, or if you want to address it, yes. But for you as an individual who's going to the grocery store, like, how much do I really like eggs? Or whatever might you want to use. Turns out I don't really care. I don't really need to eat eggs that much, especially once it gets to the point in which what it costs right now. So that's what we mean by you're economizing on its use. Prices send that signal very, very quickly, and it starts changing our behavior. So prices act as signals that convey information. So that's what I meant by prices, and the property rights system communicates information that we otherwise wouldn't have about the relative scarcities of those goods. So prices coordinate and they ration. So I mentioned that everything's scarce, or there's relative scarcities. We have to ration everything. And the price system is one rationing mechanism. And that's the rationing mechanism that gets used in a market-based system. In a socialistic system or a non-market-based economy, you use other rationing mechanisms. So you wait in line, you get on some sort of queue, for example, a lottery. So we do this in other aspects. So we have goods that are allocated through, not through markets in our country. And so the way that that typically gets done is some sort of queuing, line, a lottery, for example. So prices are coordinating and rationing. That's why it's beautiful. That's why we love it. That's why we get so excited about supply and demand, because this is all the stuff that's happening that we're trying to teach you all, and all you see is an X, which is still great. If you even remember that, we're still pretty excited about it. So, information creating and incentive harnessing capacities of private property rights explains why capitalism promotes development. So going back to those graphs and understanding those correlations that look like it's causal, it's running from capitalism to development. The theory behind it is what we just walked through. So very, very quickly in some sense, but what we just walked through of understanding that it's about private property rights, set up incentives for exchange, that then sets up the price system, and the price serves as a rationing mechanism, and that communicates relative scarcities, and we start adjusting our behavior without really even understanding why we're adjusting our behavior. Capitalism, the rules under a capitalistic system, so remember it's about the rules, induce bad men to behave better. So this is something that we can come back to when we get a little bit more into some more of the examples and specifics. But what it does is it creates constraints. And it creates constraints in a way that we don't have to have some sort of transformation of who we are in terms of to get outcomes that we might want. So in a free market economy, you only make a profit by serving others. In a truly free market economy, again, you're not having some sort of subsidy or external entity propping you up. You only can stay in business by making a profit, and you only make a profit when you are serving other people. You are solving somebody else's problems. That is in this Hayek quote. My goodness. All right. It's really wanting to pass my Hayek quote here. All right. So Hayek says, in competing with each other, sellers reveal information that is ultimately of use to buyers. Buyers likewise inform sellers. From the consumer's point of view, the function of competition is precisely to teach us who will serve us well, who can provide the most satisfactory solution for whatever particular problem we have to face. So it's all about, there are people out there who want to solve our problems. And I love that, who will serve us well. Then yes, the way that this comes out is that they will, if they do it, if they are solving problems or they're serving us in a way that we find satisfactory, they will make a profit. That's the signal that they're doing it. And so again, that does, in some ways it humanizes the whole process, I think, of understanding, okay, what does it mean when a firm's making a profit? Oh, they're providing us with something we value. Otherwise, they'd go out of business. All right, so what does this mean in terms of role of government? So capitalism, the way that we talked about it, the private ownership of the means of production, but your economic system almost always is going to have to interact with the political system. We have some cases of anarchy historically, but most of the time throughout history, we have had some sort of centralized state. So capitalism then in that sense has to address the political economic arrangement based on private property rights. So the role of government from that perspective is to protect private property rights. So it's probably not super shocking that that would be the role of government in this lecture. So refrain from weakening property rights through regulation, high taxes, or inflation. Inflation is a tax, or outright expropriation. In this country, we tend to get infringements on private property rights through different regulations, taxes, inflation. In other countries, they have outright expropriation. The government just takes whatever it wants. So looking back to that map, one of the biggest things that can explain the wealth differences is whether or not they have private property rights. Places that have private property rights, even if you don't like other things about those particular countries, they tend to be the wealthier countries. Places that have outright government expropriation tend to be incredibly poor places. Adam Smith alluded to this. Says little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence, from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. All the rest being brought about the natural course of things. And so that's his, like, here, the natural course of things is the truck bartering and exchange. Like, we're doing stuff, but there doesn't have to be some sort of centralized administration that says, hey, you have to do X, Y, and Z. Like, we're going to do it. We're going to be incentivized to do it. We're going to be incentivized to figure this stuff out. All right, so this is where it shifts into, all right, this is great. This is awesome. Capitalism's awesome. But wait a minute, there's still all these issues. There's all these issues in the world. And one area that often gets discussed in terms of a kind of a downside of capitalism, or is it the dark side or something like that, is understanding issues related to women or gender equality. And so are women being left out in terms of, we see all these benefits, so are women being left out? And so we're going to go through just look at some different statistics globally, and then we'll dig into it a little bit more. So here's a statistic you're not going to be super shocked of. This is always in the news, that women earn 77 cents for every dollar earned by men. So this is a global statistic. In the US, it's something usually 80 something now. I don't know what the gender gap that gets cited is, but something like that, right? So women earn less than men. Women spend about 3 times as many hours on unpaid domestic work, more than 7 times in Northern Africa and Western Asia. 47% of working age women participate in the labor force compared to 74% of men. Women hold 28% of managerial positions, 18% of CEOs are female. Among Fortune 500 companies, 7.4% are women. Women hold 25% of parliamentary seats. 35% of the world's STEM graduates are women. 33% of women have experienced physical and/or sexual violence by an intimate partner. So it's just a bunch of different kind of gendered statistics globally. It's not giving you anything else besides that. It's not cause and effect. It's just like, hey, this is when we look at some data, these are things that are happening around the world. There's 18 countries currently that legally require a married woman to obey their husband. So, I mean, some of them you might not be super shocked at they would make this list, but there are then become, what happens if you go back to the previous slide is there's these disparities, and then it starts pushing us to why. And so then one thing you start doing is you look at the laws or rules or institutions, right? So that's the way economists tend to, our analysis, our brains tend to work. So then we can start looking at, okay, what are some of the legal restrictions? And this is one that, in my mind, kind of stands out. Again, most of us grew up in this country, and so that's not something that we've had to experience or that is that common to us. In 2010, so this is all this data in terms of the gendered legal discrepancies comes from out of the World Bank. They have what's called the Women, Business, and the Law Index. It's freely available. You guys can look this stuff up. But as of 2010, no woman shared the same legal rights to economic opportunities as men in 2010 at that point. Currently, about 2.4 billion women face gender discrimination before the law. So again, this is globally. About 176 countries maintain legal barriers that prevent full economic participation. So this can be things as simple as they're not allowed to work. There's also rules on the types of jobs that women could have, or like they're not allowed to work at night. That's one that's somewhat common in some countries. Currently, there's 14 countries that do not impose any gender legal disparity. So that before the law, there's equal treatment. That's the way to think about it, between men and women. And so one of the things, if you just look at this list of countries versus the other list of countries, and like in your brain, thinking about what we've been talking about with economic freedom and capitalism, the prior list, less capitalistic, current list, more capitalistic, right? So Belgium and Canada and Denmark tend to be at the higher part of the economic freedom index. Iceland, Ireland, they're all at the top. So you can kind of see where this is going. There's a lot of consequences from having gendered legal disparities. So gender inequalities lead to poor health for both women and children, less human capital investment, poor quality of governments, lower standards of living, lower economic growth. So all of that's pulled from a body of work that's looking at kind of the consequences of these gendered laws. However, even though the economists tend to look at it from one perspective, in other social sciences, capitalism is to blame for these negative effects, for the data on this slide a couple slides ago, where 77% or women earn 77 cents on the dollar per man. So it's just assumed, oh, that's because of capitalism. So the arguments are typically something like markets exploit women, it glorifies success, paid versus unpaid labor. There's, again, a wage gap. And this idea that this is more of a recent one, that consumer culture leads to gendered preferences. And this is where we get to preferred solutions such as minimum wage or gender quotas, government mandated family leave, government funded childcare, equal pay, required promotions. And so with that, it's assumed that capitalism is the problem and therefore you need more restrictions. So that's the logic linking these two things together. And so economists don't typically like to do analysis that way. So we're like, well, hey, why don't we have the data on this now, so why don't we look? And so that was one of my papers where we look at economic freedom and women's economic rights. And turns out more countries that are more capitalistic or more economically free, women in those countries enjoy more economic opportunities. There's also relating capitalism to regulation of women. So more capitalism, women in that sense are deregulated. So the index is that, this is from the Women Business and the Law Index, where you're looking at legal restrictions on work, pay, etc. And in capitalistic countries, women are more likely to share the same rights as men before the law. So this is all equal treatment before the law type ideas. So maybe we shouldn't be so quick to blame capitalism. So gendered outcomes typically stem from choices. So this is Claudia Golden recently just won the Nobel Prize in economics for a lot of her work that really highlighted this. So we face different choices, or we see different choices between men and women in their investment in human capital. Occupation, hours worked, and time out of the labor force. Now we can get, and we probably won't have that much time to do that. But we can get into understanding why that's the case. But whenever we're thinking of trying to understand the differences between, for example, just the gender wage gap, it ultimately pushes you back down to a conversation of looking at people's choices. So what happens in those statistics is they lump everybody in men versus women without any distinction in terms of type of work, and so hours worked, or your major, for example. And so when you start comparing apples to apples, so Thomas Sowell is one who's done this more recently, but other economists have as well, where once you correct that you make their major, type of job that they're holding, hours worked, if you hold all of that constant, so you're basically comparing apples to apples, then women typically make a little bit more than men. in the same position. So some of the statistics are very skewed because you think, oh, there must be discrimination, there must be some sort of exploitation, hence capitalism is to blame. Well, it's like, actually, if you dig into it, what's happening is there's a difference in choices, which then leads us and me, as throughout like kind of my career, to start thinking about culture. So how do cultural norms matter? Because culture clearly is going to impact perceptions or kind of fostering or facilitating whether or not women go to college, or whether or not women become engineers, or women become economists, or they take time out of the labor force, or they spend more time with the work that is required within a home if you're raising kids. And so culture matters and kind of underpins a lot of these differences in the way that we may go about making decisions and making our choices. So that's where we get to the idea of culture. So what is culture? You may be again shocked that economists talk about culture. It's become more and more common over the last really 10 years for economists to include this as part of kind of our toolkit when we're trying to have a broader understanding of what determines human action, what determines people's decisions. But the way that we tend to think of it is beliefs or attitudes, values that bear on economic activities of individuals, organizations, and other institutions. Customary beliefs and values that ethnic, religious, and social groups transmit fairly unchanged from generation to generation. Basically, you can think of it as its values and beliefs about how the world works, but it's also norms of behavior derived from those values. So one example I like to give, we think about entrepreneurship or innovation is you can have legal restrictions in terms of whether or not you can own a business, man or a woman. So it goes back to kind of the property rights argument. So can you legally open a business? In our country, yes, you can. In other countries, no, you can't. But, so that's what we call the de jure rules or constraints. But then you can also have informal or cultural constraints where maybe in kind of pulp culture or in literature and movies, our interactions with each other, if you own a business, oh, that's gross. Oh, you're a greedy capitalist. Oh, don't do that. Go work for a nonprofit. So socially, you want to be loved. You want praise. You want social praise. You want your friends to respect what you do. So instead of starting a business, you do something else. So that's what we mean by kind of the formal legal rules of the game that incentivize us to behave a certain way. But our cultural norms also is going to shape those decisions and our behavior as well. So it can impose constraints on our behavior and the choices that we ultimately make. I tend to focus on this idea of what we call individualism versus collectivism, so more of a specific part of culture. So culture is in that sense very, very broad. So within economics and my own research, we focused on individualism versus collectivism. And what that means is there's this distinction or a degree to which individuals are integrated into cohesive groups versus individual responsibility. It emphasizes, so individualism emphasizes personal freedom and achievement. There's a wars for social status to personal achievement in individualistic cultures. It can be thought of as capitalistic values. Dr. Dutta has a paper that kind of links that together. And it is shown to be the most robust dimension of culture in terms of looking at individualism versus collectivism. So countries that have cultures that are more individualistic tend to also be your wealthier countries. And this is also shown up with all the causal inference fun studies that we can do. So that's a pretty well accepted finding in economics literature now. So back to the big puzzle, the big economic puzzle, what causes human flourishing? Well, cultures that view you as an individual and not tied to a group, or they view you as a person and not your race or not necessarily your gender or your ethnicity or your religion, which clearly makes up part of who you are, but you're a human, you're an individual, that type of distinction, those types of cultures tend to be places that are wealthier. Where I picked up some of this work is to look at culture relating then to gender equality. So what types of cultures would view women as their equals, women as equals as men. And so the idea here being that feminism actually has its roots in the Enlightenment. So if you go back to the Enlightenment writers, John Locke, for example, talked about extending rights to women, which was incredibly radical at the time. That if we're really talking about that, all those kind of Enlightenment values, that you wouldn't just confer them to men, right? So that there's not any distinction in the way that we're really talking about this. So the classical liberal values would be extended to everybody, including women. That was, again, a very radical proposition. But those arguments that we're making today are hundreds of years old. But those ideas, those Enlightenment ideas, are not universally accepted, especially historically. And so we built off of this to argue that the values of individualistic societies, so autonomy, self-expression, creativity, an ethos of individual rights, are inherently egalitarian. And it should transcend gender identities. You can make the same case that it should transcend race, should transcend religion, ethnicity. So as a result, we argue that it would support women as individuals and equals to men, right? You're a person. You're not just this group. You're not this part of this collective. That's the idea. And so there's a web of relationships and obligations that characterize more collectivist societies. They may then ascribe more subordinate roles to women. So as a result, you would end up de-emphasizing personal goals to emphasize the group, the collective, the church, nation, family. That's what we mean by a collective. So we look at cross-country survey data to see if this idea kind of holds up. So one paper, of several papers in this space, one paper we collect individual level survey data. We didn't do the survey. It's called the World Values Survey. And it includes about 100 countries starting in 1981 till currently. So it's a very robust data source. And we were able to create a measure of individualism. And we look at patriarchal attitudes. We look at labor force participation. We look at fertility rates, education, things that we tend to care about. And we find that individualistic cultures are more accepting of gender equal attitudes, attitudes toward employment, attitudes toward working. So there's a question in there: is it a problem if a woman makes more than a man? And if you as an individual hold more individualistic values, so you believe in individual responsibility, think of it that way, then you tend to not have an issue if a woman makes more than a man, for example. There's lower support for a gender division of labor, so that women as mothers and caregivers, that's their proper role. So again, there's questions relating that. Individuals who hold more individualistic values, you see more women working outside the home, more female education, and lower fertility. So that, in some sense, we collectively are thinking then there's support for this hypothesis. So individualism, these capitalistic values, we argue is promoting gender equality. So then, so that was all at the individual level, and then we basically do the analysis at the country level. So individualism, reductions in patriarchal attitudes. So what things included in this index are questions related to, do men make better political leaders? Do men make better executives? Universities more suited for a boy? So that's what we mean by patriarchal attitudes. Again, more individualism, more female employment, more female education, reductions in fertility, and more women's economic rights. So this is another Hayek quote, but to me kind of pulls all this together. It says it would scarcely be too much to claim that the main merit of individualism, which is referring back to Adam Smith, and his contemporaries advocated, is that it is a system under which bad men can do least harm. And he kind of goes on to say it's a social system basically where it isn't dependent on us electing the right people or being good people or being the smartest people. And I think that is an incredibly timely quote right now in the way that however you're viewing decision making right now, it's that what you ultimately want is that the system doesn't depend on that. And I think that's just a really good reminder of that, and that's something that Hayek was pointing back to, and that what he is referencing is that it's the culture of individualism is going to create a system where bad men can do the least harm. All right, so the summary of all of this, pulling all of this together, we've hit on a lot of topics. So if wealth is better than poverty, life is better than death, knowledge is better than ignorance, and liberty is better than oppression, then capitalism deserves to be cheered. That's when we look at theory and we look at evidence. That's what's coming out over and over and over again. Policy mandates aimed at gender equality, so quotas, things like that, may have little payoff if the culture does not align. There's other reasons why it may have other perverse or unintended consequences. But at a minimum, we have to consider the cultural environment in which those rules are being mandated and being created. Ultimately, what I think is that this challenges the prevailing notion that capitalism is bad for women. It provides empirical evidence supporting the argument that economically free countries can establish both formal and informal safeguards for women's well-being. Lastly, we should connect. All right, we still have time for some questions. Again, I know that's kind of a lot thrown out there.
And I'll bring the microphone around so we can have the question be recorded.
Well, it's one of the questions I didn't know how to answer earlier. So, do you think cultural values like individualism and are more or less important than economic factors in promoting women's economic rights?
So do I think culture is more important than the other economic factors? I mean, probably. So depends on what you mean by that. We think about it a couple ways. One is that your culture is going to ultimately feed into your formal rules. So those legal restrictions placed on women, if you go back to the countries that I put up there that had that legally a married woman must obey her husband, that's coming out of their cultural norms and biases, right? So that's not just out of nowhere. So your culture informs your formal rules that come out of your political system and your and then impacts your economic system as well. So I do think that from that perspective, yes, it very much so matters. Then you can also think about it from, okay, well, if you change the formal rules, how's that going to feed back into impacting culture? And so oftentimes what we find is that you can change the formal rule, but if the culture doesn't change, it may not have that much of a payoff. So let's say that Afghanistan removed the legal restriction that a woman must obey her husband. Would that change that much in the household? Probably not, maybe, and probably not for a while, maybe eventually. So I'm not advocating to not change the rule, right? But it's just more of the understanding that the culture and ingrained behavior, because it may be tied to your religion and what you ultimately believe in terms of why we're here, very much constrains our behavior. Other economic factors, I think it's in that way, it's all related to ultimately what type of economic system you're operating in. So yes, culture matters.
I don't know if you would answer this. Where do those cultures come from, like developing individualistic versus collectivistic? And do you think that those cultures can change? Because if you're saying that all of these like policy, like institutional changes won't actually have an effect if the culture is still there.
There's a lot of interesting work trying to figure that out. Some of it, economists tie it to the timing of the agricultural revolution. We look at what the history of plow usage. So how does that matter, right? So a plow requires upper body strength that at least historically a lot of women didn't have. So that's where you start seeing the division of labor, a gender division of labor, where men then plowed the fields and women then tended more to more other things. They're doing lots of stuff still. And so they tie things like that back to then what shapes culture. Religion clearly shapes cultural attitudes toward everything. So it's multifaceted, it's not one dimensional, but then that just means it's interesting. So I didn't really answer your question. everything, history, religion, all the things. How can it change? Obviously, culture can change. Yes, clearly. How? I had a paper years ago that tried to argue that our interactions with people that are different than us changes our culture. And how I argued that was we should have more trade. We should have more free trade. So if you want just exposure, if you want more tolerance, for example, you need to be exposed to people who are different than you. And how better to do that than through exchange, because you're providing meeting a need that I have. And you look different than me, but now we're interacting in a market transaction, but I'm actually learning more about who you are and your culture and maybe your language or your religion, and we're like becoming friends. So there's a Greek word for exchange, which is katallaxy, and it actually means to bring a stranger into friendship. And if you've ever, the do commerce thesis is all about that through commercial interactions, basically we become friends, and creates tolerance, understanding. And then I think through that, you're going to have lots of cultural exchange happens, and then cultural transformation happens. It's just another reason for trade.
Considering all of the benefits that capitalism brings, where do you think the bad reputation comes from that capitalism tends to have, especially in those countries that profit most from it?
Excellent question. I don't know, but I think part of it is the economists are to blame. We have terrible PR. Like, we're just not good at messaging. But there are political incentives to do that, to blame the system, blame capitalism, blame something else to achieve some other things, right? So it's not about achieving growth. So one of the things, like, and right now, to an economist, when we look at what Trump is doing in terms of the tariffs, we're like, oh my gosh, this is awful. We're going to have less growth and a whole host of things, the higher prices, everybody's going to be worse off. But maybe that's not what he cares about, right? So if he's trying to achieve some other end, then maybe tariffs are exactly what would achieve his end. We just don't know what his end is, or his goal. So that's, like, again, the way of thinking about it. We were talking in one of the discussion groups, Schumpeter's talked about this, Mises has talked about this, Adam Smith even talked about it, that in some ways capitalism sows its own demise, maybe because we lose sight of the wealth creation process, that this isn't like we're just take everything for granted. Envy, jealousy, because it does create inequality. So if everybody is poor, everybody's equal, everybody's equally poor. Everybody's not going to be equally rich. The process is lumpy and bumpy. I mean, some people don't like that. So those are some ideas that have been kind of pitched out there as to why is it that you're right, even in the more capitalistic countries, it seems to have the loudest advocates against it. There's a hand here.
This is more of like a clarification. So
Yeah.
for, the slide where you're talking about the countries that don't have legal separation for like women or like
Yes.
the restraints, I feel often I see online that some of those countries, people say, oh, this is a socialist country, like, you know, some of the Netherlands, Denmark and stuff like that. Are those socialist countries, or they're actually capitalist countries? They just have some socialist programs, correct?
Yes, exactly. Sweden, Denmark, not socialist countries, incredibly open. They are some of the most free trade countries in the world. So as Dr. Stivers was mentioning, the way that we try to measure this, it has many components. And so if you look at a country like Sweden or Denmark or the Scandinavian countries, they're also the most individualistic countries. But they, very free trade, strong property rights, they do have a larger size of government. So you do get some more social provisions. It's still not the way that we do social provisions in this country, but that's the thing. So what the Bernie Sanders of the world tag onto is, oh, look, they have more, unemployment benefits or healthcare provided through the state, but they otherwise are incredibly free market. So yes, that was the answer to your own question. Thanks for asking that. It's a really good question.
Ask a question. To some extent, Claudia, I was thinking getting back to the previous question that Josh was asking. It doesn't really answer the question, but I was thinking that sort of capitalism is allowing for people to defame capitalism. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, because you have the freedom to do that. I mean, that doesn't really directly answer your question of like why, but it's sort of like you also have the freedom to blame it, and then it is creating that freedom.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So this comes back to, somebody have a question? I can keep talking, but I would like to hear from you. But this comes back to your political system. So you maybe can scream about it, but can you lobby, or, what is the relationship that you can have with your government to say, okay, now stop this from happening? Like, don't allow competition, or don't allow, that would happen in the market.
Any other questions? Or maybe I'll add on to that last point then.
Yeah.
When you mentioned earlier that, private ownership of the means of production also means you own your own labor, I thought that was interesting, because one of the criticisms I see of capitalism is it's like, oh, you're required to work, right? You have to go out and work, otherwise you won't make a living, you won't survive without working. So like capitalism gets equate to forced labor in a sense. Not sure if you have any thoughts on that.
You don't have to. You can do whatever you want. The problem is you want things, many, many, many things. And the way you have to acquire those things is by paying for them. And then that means you have to have some money. And unless somebody's giving that to you, you have to work for it, right? So it's not, capitalism isn't the problem, or work really isn't the problem in that sense. It's all of your competing desires, all the things that you want, and that make your life better, or otherwise you wouldn't want them. You think that it's going to make your life better, otherwise you wouldn't want it. But no, you can chill, you can hang out. Nobody's forcing you to do that. Under a socialistic system, yeah, somebody can tell you can't just hang out and play video games. You got to go to work. And this is what you're getting paid, even if you don't like it. And that's exactly what happened under Soviet Union, Communist China, Cuba, North Korea. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I think we're out of time, but join me in thanking our guest speaker.
Thank you, guys.
Everybody.